Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill McBride, and I'm the Asia Pacific representative for the SQF program. Thank you very much for the invitation to join SGS and all of you at the SGS Korea SQF session this afternoon, the webinar this afternoon. Sorry I can't be there in person, but that's the issue with travel these days. We're not able to go anywhere. So hopefully I can spend a little bit of time with you this afternoon just explaining SQF in the global supply chain. SQF is no stranger to South Korea. We have 54 certified sites, all of which are certified through SGS in Korea. So thank you to SGS Korea for their involvement, participation. I can remember training a couple of your auditors many years ago. All of the certified sites are in the SQF, are in the manufacturing sector. Some of them in seafood processing, 20 involved in seafood processing, and then 8 or 9 involved in canning, UHT and aseptic operations, and preserved foods manufacturing, in food ingredient manufacturing, and recipe meals manufacturing. So we have a long relationship with SQF SQF and SGS in Korea. But how did SQF first get started? It really goes back to the 80s and 90s, which was a catalyst moment in food safety management certification. Back in the 80s, and I was with one of the major food manufacturers in Australia in the 1980s. It was all about hygiene and GMP. HACCP wasn't really used. There were audits, but there were basically housekeeping audits, hygiene audits in the 1980s. And then, of course, in 1987, ISO 9000 was published. ISO 9000 is the quality management standard and became very popular, was used right across industry, but really wasn't applicable to the food industry, and certainly not the agricultural industry. It was considered too big, too cumbersome. So in the mid-90s, you saw a number of initiatives in the food industry and food safety management in particular. Codex HACCP was formalized in 1997. HACCP had been around for a long time before that, but it was finally documented and formalized by Codex Alimentarius Commission in 97. Europe GAP, which became Global GAP, was launched in the primary sector in 1997. BRC was first launched in 1998, but a couple of years before that, in 1995, SQF was first started. SQF started in the state of Western Australia, in the continent, in the country of Australia, in this country. It was a project by the Department of Agriculture in Western Australia to develop quality management systems for local farmers. ISO systems were considered too costly, too cumbersome, not appropriate to primary production. So it first researched with livestock and produce industries in 1994-95, and then the first SQF certificate was issued in 1995. And it was for the produce industry. It was for table grape growers. I'm old enough to be able to remember that. And in those days, SQF certificate was a sort of 10-page document, which was not terribly complex. Did include HACCP, even though HACCP was not finally formalized for a couple of years. And it stayed that way until it was purchased by the Food Industry Association, what was then known as the Food Marketing Institute, which is why they've kept the acronym FMI, in 2003. It really outgrew Western Australia, outgrew Australia, and gradually moved into other primary sectors and then into manufacturing, and became very popular in the eastern states of Australia before it was picked up. And by the way, this was facilitated by SGS. SGS was very close to the origins of SQF back in those days. So it was purchased by FMI in 2003 and really didn't do much until later that decade when GFSI moved into the United States. And then because SQF was and still is the only major GFSI standard that is based in the US, it became very popular and we started seeing a lot of growth after that. So the growth sort of started from about 2008, 2009, and 2012. We combined everything into one document, edition 7, in 2012, which became the SQF code. Prior to that, it was called SQF 2000 in manufacturing, SQF 1000 in primary production. We combined it all into the SQF code in 2012. Then there's been a couple of iterations since then. And in 2020, in October 2020, just October last year, we published edition 9 of the SQF code. And now from the first certificate in 1995, 25 years later, and we've just finished celebrating our 25th anniversary, we have roughly 10,000 certificates, mainly in North America, but also still substantially in Australia and New Zealand, in Japan, Korea, and China. SQF has always been involved with GFSI, been involved with them since the inception of GFSI in the year 2000. I mentioned before that BRC, IFS, Global Gap, SQF started in the late 90s. In 2000, they came together as GFSI. GFSI was then a retailer-run organization based in Paris, based in Europe. Started off with the European retailers. Then the manufacturers came into that, and it became an opportunity, a platform for the major stakeholders in retail and manufacturing to get together with government and industry representatives, IGOs, etc., to look at the needs and the future for food safety globally. SQF, as I said, has been involved since 2000, since it started in 2000, and was one of the original 4 benchmark schemes, which were BRC, IFS, Dutch HACCP, and SQF. First benchmarked in 2004 to GFSI and continues to be benchmarked to this day. We're now up to version 8 of the GFSI benchmarking requirements, and SQF has gone through a number of iterations to meet the changing GFSI requirements and continues to be recognized by GFSI to this day, and also continues to play an active role in GFSI working groups. For those that are not familiar with GFSI, GFSI provides requirements for food safety certification program owners. They're now called CPOs, not schemes, seeking recognition. It lists the key technical elements for the production of safe food, for feed, for packaging, or service provision, and provides guidance on food safety management requirements and their ongoing improvement. It's science-based. And as I indicated before, it sort of brings together the key stakeholders in the industry, in the IGOs, in the World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, in ISO, in the International Accreditation Foundation, training centers, governments, etc. that are involved in food safety. And increasingly, we're seeing public-private partnerships between GFSI and some of the major government agencies around the world. So by benchmarking, we mean it's equivalent. The standards are equivalent to the GFSI requirements. You will see the term GFSI certified. GFSI itself does not certify sites. GFSI recognizes standards or CPOs that recognize sites, that certify sites. But also, as well as meeting the GFSI requirements, and SQF considers GFSI as the foundation for growth in the SQF program. It's also retailer driven. I mentioned already that SQF is owned by FMI, the Food Industry Association, which brings together a wide range of member companies. including retailers, producers, manufacturers, wide variety of companies, including critical services. And that includes, major household names in the US like Kroger, Walgreens, Berry, Walmart, Whole Foods, Panagra, HEB, etc., and increasingly the online service providers, including Amazon, etc., Whole Foods, which has moved into the the contemporary retail space now. So a number of them, Publix, etc., and also some international retailers. So it brings together these organizations, and some, not all of them, are using SQF as their primary standard, but gradually you're seeing SQF as the primary food safety management standard within the US industry. It's also part of our objective is not just to use GFSI as a foundation, but to meet our retailer requirements, because the retailers, particularly in Western countries, tend to drive the industry. They drive back against it. Again, it's that due diligence approach, which happened in the 1990s and came into regulations in the 90s, so that retailers had a responsibility, a legal responsibility, to push food safety back through their supply chain as a defense of due diligence. So we're seeing that in the US, other countries which have imposed GFSI benchmark standards, and also in this country, in Australia. The Australian industry Australia itself, which has a land area about the same size as the US, has a population about 10% of the US. We only have about 25 million people within this country. And yet we have one of the most concentrated retail sectors in the world. In Australia, there are two retailers, Coles and Woolworths, that account for 80% of the food retail industry in this country. They're now starting to be challenged by overseas retailers coming into Australia. We've got Aldi here as a low-cost alternative, IGA, which is the Independent Grocery Alliance, which is owned by Metcash, and also Costco Wholesale, which is obviously a US-based retail wholesale organization, which has about 2% of the market now. But you're still seeing Woolworths and Coles with roughly 80% of the market. Both those retailers, in fact, Costco and Aldi as well, but both the major retailers require a GFSI benchmark standard for their supply base for food and consumables into their retailers. Woolworths has what they call their Supplier Excellence Program. Level 1 of that requires a GFSI, one of the major GFSI benchmark schemes. They don't use any GFSI benchmark scheme, but all the retailers must be certified to, all the suppliers, beg your pardon, must be certified to a GFSI benchmark scheme. And SQF is the predominant scheme within the Australian industry. Coles as well, their opposition, Woolworths is Sydney-based organisation. Coles is a Melbourne-based organisation, although they're both national in their footprint. Coles also has a supplier audit program, which requires them to be suppliers to be certified to one of the GFSI benchmark schemes, and that is predominantly SQF within this country. But it's not just here. You find in other countries as well, particularly in the US and Canada, that the retailers are driving SQF growth. One of the examples, the best example is HEB, which is a Texas-based retailer, very large retailer, but down in that Texas part of the country. They topped the dunnhumby Retailer Preference Index for customer service and performance in 2020. And has supported SQF in the supply chain. Because remember, these retailers are not just retailers, they're also manufacturers. They tend to either own or contract manufacturing sites to do branded product into their retailers. So they have a lot of interest in the manufacturing sector as well as the retail sector. And HEB has supported SQF in the supply chain for 10 years. Actually, I think it's more than 10 years. I can remember back in 2007, 2008, HEB was very prominent in SQF. They have 20 to 30 SQF certified sites or logistics centers in the US, and they use SQF certified sites to produce their exclusive own brand products and generate increased sales. So it's very much not just based on GFSI and not just based on regulatory requirements. Let me emphasize that as well. SQF in every country we operate in is based on the food safety regulatory requirements within that country and within the country of sale if it is different. So the country of manufacture and the country of sale. So we're based on meeting regulatory requirements. We're obviously based on Codex HACCP because that is the foundation of all GFSI requirements. We use the GFSI requirements as the foundation for growth and maintenance of the SQF program. And we also try to do our best to meet all our retail requirements moving forward. So where are we now? I mentioned it, edition 9. Is the current version of the SQF codes. It was published in October of 2020 and became applicable from May 24th this year. In other words, all initial and recertification audits from that date, from May 24th, are to edition 9. So it is now the current version of the SQF codes. Rather than in edition 7, we had the one document which covered every industry sector. Now we have 10 food safety codes plus the quality code that apply to edition 9. Up the top there, you will see the manufacturing codes, the SQF food safety code for food manufacturing, which covers most food manufacturing sectors, and I'll come back to the sectors shortly. We have the SQF food safety code for animal feed manufacture. That's feed that goes into the animal livestock and the industries where sites are raising livestock for food consumption. We have the SQF food safety code for pet food manufacturing, which covers domestic pets. We have the SQF food safety code for animal product manufacturing. That's separate from food manufacturing because it includes the requirements for safe, hygienic, and sustainable animal slaughter, as well as the value-added manufacturing of animal products. And we have a new code, the SQF food safety code for dietary supplements, manufacturing of dietary supplements. Dietary supplements are things like the vitamins and capsules, etc., which is an increasing market demand and which requires regulations which are very often over and above the food safety regulations that apply in country, and generally they are considered they're products that can be sold through health food shops as well as through supermarkets. Bottom left there, the orange colored ones are the primary product primary production codes, primary animal production, primary plant production, and aquaculture. Then we have a code for the manufacture of food packaging, which is all food packaging that is used in the food manufacturing industry, as well as in catering and food service. It can be single-use packaging items such as cups, paper plates, etc., and cartons, flexible cans, glass, etc., that is used in the manufacture of food packaging. Then we have a code for food safety for storage and distribution, which only applies to companies, beg your pardon, that are involved in the storage and distribution of product. It's not covering warehouses that are attached to manufacturing plants because they're covered in food manufacturing. It is just food businesses that are only involved in storage and distribution. And then we also have the quality code, which I'll also talk about in a few moments. Now, the structure of all the food safety codes is much the same. It doesn't vary much between the codes, except in the GMP modules, which I'll touch on in a minute. It's really part A and part B. Part A is the implementation guide for new sites and existing sites that want to implement SQF or manage or maintain their SQF certification. It's in 3 parts. A1 is the food sector categories that are used in the code. A2 is the steps for sites that want to implement SQF. So the steps to achieving SQF certification. And then once you reach that point, A3 is the steps in maintaining your SQF certification. So part A is just guidance. Part B is that section in the middle. It's the system elements and the GAP or GMP modules. It's what's the shaded blue there on the slide. That is the auditable standard, the system elements and the GMP modules or GAP modules. And they must be implemented and maintained to achieve SQF certification. Number of requirements there: management commitment, and the food safety management part, management commitment, document control and records, specifications and formulations, the food safety system, which is following Codex HACCP, verification of the food safety system, product traceability and crisis management, food defense and food fraud, allergen management, and training are all the requirements within the system elements. The other part, what is down here, the example here is the GMP module for the food safety code for food manufacturing, but it can be in the storage and distribution code. It can be in the primary codes as GAP. Storage and distribution codes would be GDP, good distribution practices. It's all the GMP, or good manufacturing, good agricultural practice elements that need to be followed as well. Site location, requirements for site location, for site operation, for personal hygiene, for personal processing practices, the use of water, ice, and air if applicable, a receipt, storage, and transport, separation of functions, and waste disposal are the headings or the section headings in GMP. So that middle section, the system elements and the GMP modules, are what you need to follow, what you need to document, what you need to apply to achieve SQF certification. And you need to apply it as applicable to your particular business and industry sector. There's also within each of the codes of food sector a description of the food sector categories, the glossary, the definition of terms that are used within all the codes, the rules for use of the SQF logo, that logo you see up in the top left-hand corner. We have the rules for use of that. It cannot be used on product, but it can be used on business cards, on advertising, on marketing materials, on TV advertising, on point of sale materials, etc. And also the requirements for multi-site certification are in the appendices as well. I've mentioned a few times FSCs, or food sector categories, and just to give you a description of what that is. They're summarized in Part A of the SQF codes, and the detail as an example that the table listed on the bottom there for food sector category 10, which is dairy food processing. They're detailed in Appendix 1. SQF auditors must be qualified by food sector category, registered by food sector category, and can only audit food sector categories for which they are registered. So your site is registered according to your food sector category. Let's say it's in dairy food processing or seafood processing or primary plant production, but you're registered against one or more food sector categories, and your auditors must also be registered against those food sector categories to make sure there's alignment, that auditors are only going to facilities where they understand the process and products. And sites are certified to a food sector category, which is tied to an SQF code module. And as I say, that table at the bottom is taken from the table in Appendix 1. The example here is dairy food processing. We indicate what the GFSI industry scope is because their scopes are slightly different from our food sector categories. The applicable SQF codes and modules that apply, a description of what it means, applies to the processing, transport, and storage of food products from all species of milk, etc., and includes examples of products which it includes or excludes. For example, this also includes milk substitute products such as soy milk or almond milk, etc. So that's clearly indicated in the Appendix 1 of the food safety safety codes. So which code would apply? So if your company, if your business is involved in primary animal production, in the capture, harvesting of livestock or game animals, then you would use the SQF food safety code for primary animal production. If you're involved in any growing or production of fresh fruit or vegetables or nuts, or the packing of fresh produce and nuts, then you would use the primary plant production. And that covers 4 food sector categories. It covers the indoor growing and harvesting of fresh produce of, say, tomatoes, mushrooms, etc., that are grown indoors, or sprouted seed crops. It's a new food sector category, and that would you would use primary plant production. Same with the outside growing and production of fresh produce, pack houses, as I already mentioned, and also extensive broadacre agricultural operations like wheat fields, wheat, corn, oats, rice, etc., would all be covered under broadacre agricultural operations. They would all come under primary plant production, and you would use whichever module applies to your particular food sector category. Aquaculture, the SQF Food Safety Code for agriculture applies to the intensive farming of seafood, and it's only farming of seafood. The SQF Food Safety Code for food manufacturing covers all manufacturing sectors, apart from animal products, which I'll come to in a moment. Dairy, honey, egg processing, bakery and snack foods, fruit, vegetables and nut processing, canning, UHT and aseptic operations, ice drink, beverage processing, confectionery, etc. All those food sector categories are covered by the Food Safety Code for food manufacturing. That's the code that applies to any one of those food sector categories. So why do we have them in separate categories? Well, again, so that the auditor who comes to your canning operation has food sector category 15. In other words, he or she has been to an approved processing course and attended and successfully completed a food process retort processing course or UHT processing course, and understands canning, UHT and aseptic operations. So we make sure that there's alignment between the site and the auditor. Mentioned animal products manufacturing is different, and that's because there are slaughtering requirements, boning and butchery operation requirements for animal products, which don't apply to the other food manufacturing codes. So the SQF Food Safety Code for manufacturing is very similar to the food manufacturing code, but it adds the requirements for the hygienic and operation of slaughtering, boning and butchery operations, as well as for the processing of value-added processing of manufactured meats and poultry, and for seafood processing. I mentioned already the Food Safety Code for manufacture of dietary supplements is a new code. We also have the codes for pet food and animal feed and for food packaging, which only apply to their particular industry sectors. Why do we have separate codes? Because the regulatory requirements, as well as the industry requirements for dietary supplements, pet food, animal feed, and food packaging are different to those for the food manufacturing sector. Then we have the SQF Food Safety Code for storage and distribution, FSC 26, which again only applies to businesses that are involved in storage. So it's distribution centers, storage operations, transport operations that are only involved in storing and distributing. They're not involved in manufacturing. and it doesn't apply to warehouses that are attached to manufacturing operations because they come under the manufacturing operation. Then we also have the SQF Food Safety Code for retail, for food retail operations, and the SQF Food Safety Code for food service, for catering or food service operations. And I also mentioned the quality code before. SQF quality code is not GFSI benchmark because GFSI does not benchmark, does not recognize quality standards. It only recognizes food safety standards. But the quality code is an important adjunct to the food safety codes. Sites need to be certified to the SQF Food Safety Code or any other GFSI recognized standard. So sites can be certified to BRC, to IFS, to FSSC 22000, or to HACCP, to ISO 22000. And as long as they maintain that certification, they can also apply for recognition to the SQF quality code. Why would they do that? Because it helps to reduce product recall and costs. It indicates a commitment to quality and customer requirements, and some retailers are requesting the SQF quality code for their supply chain, and improves customer trust and branding. And also because I mentioned before that you cannot use a food safety mark to recognize food safety certification in a product, but you can use the quality shield. The SQF quality shield can be applied if the site is certified. The SQF quality shield can be applied to products, to retail products, to shelf-ready products on the shelf in retailers, and is in a lot of the, in China, in Japan, in many of the Asian countries. It's applied as well as in the US and Australia. It includes the certification body name. It includes its unique site number on the quality shield, and is commonly used not just on product, but in marketing, in advertising within those countries. So it's a customized quality management standard for the food industry. The focus is on HACCP to identify and manage quality threats. Its focus is also on meeting customer requirements and on process control to continuously improve productivity and quality simultaneously. But sites must remain certified to the SQF Food Safety Code or other food safety management standard to maintain their quality certification. And it needs to be audited by an SQF auditor who is registered for quality. So just I mentioned before, the left-hand column here, the system elements out of the SQF food safety codes. You've also got the GAP, GMP modules for the food safety codes. The additional requirements for the quality code are in the table on the right. And you can see the structure is very similar to those for the food safety codes. Again, you've got management commitment, document control and records, specifications, formulations, realization, and supplier approval, all from a quality aspect rather than a food safety aspect. The food quality system is again HACCP based, but it's using the HACCP process to identify and control quality hazards, quality threats within the system, as well as food safety threats within the SQF food safety codes. There's also quality system verification, product identification, traceability, etc., that is quality based. There is food fraud, not food defense, but food fraud in the quality code as well, because not all food fraud is food safety related. Remember, food fraud is commercially based. It's to make money. It's not necessarily to hurt people. So food fraud can have a quality implication as well as a food safety implication. We've got the a requirement for identity preserved foods, where a site is labeling their products as kosher or halal or organic or any of those acronyms that apply now. Is a requirement for maintaining the identity preservation of those foods through the production operation, and there's also a requirement for trading. So that's the quality code. It's not compulsory, it's not mandatory, it's voluntary for sites that want to go in that direction, but it applies to the any of the SQF food safety codes or any other food safety management standard. We also have, and I didn't touch on this before, but I just want to refer to it now. We also have introductory standards for small to medium-sized food businesses that either don't want to go as far as a GFSI benchmark standard or don't need to, or just don't have the resources to be able to do that. We call it SQF fundamentals. It's a pre-GFSI, they're not GFSI benchmark. It's like the step before GFSI. We have 2 standards for primary production and 2 for manufacturing, basic and intermediate for primary production, and basic and intermediate for food manufacturing. And the focus is on the implementation of food safety practices rather than documentation. It's similar to GFSI has what they call their global markets program. We also have a lot of our retailers that use local suppliers, small local suppliers, and want them to have some level of certification, some level of understanding of their food safety responsibilities, but they don't need them to go as far as the full SQF food safety codes. So they encourage them to go through the fundamental program. And we've got a number of those actually running in some of the Asian countries at this point of time. It can also lead to sites that start off with the fundamentals program of then progressing to full SQF food safety codes or other food safety management standards as they wish to. So sometimes it's a request from retailers, sometimes it's just a request from the sites themselves that want to undertake some level of food safety training and food safety management standards to meet their regulatory requirements and their market needs. And of course, that can lead to the SQF food safety codes, and then and again, it's all voluntary, to the quality code if required. Just to give you an example of how SQF applies right throughout the food supply chain. In the middle of this slide, you see the SQF food safety code for primary animal production, which is primary production of livestock, of beef, of pigs, cattle, pigs, poultry, etc., for human consumption. And that is covered in the primary animal production code. That leads through to slaughterhouse and value-added manufacturing of meat products, which are covered by the food safety code for animal product manufacturing. That can then lead on to other food manufacturing, in the case of bakery industry, recipe meals industry, etc., and to storage and distribution codes. And it can also lead to the SQF quality code if the supply chain or the retailer expects that, etc. And we're seeing that in some of the retailer-driven supply chains, that they want control and they want to ensure the integrity of product right through their supply chain. So they want every part of that supply chain covered. So this is just an example from the meat supply chain. You've also got on the left-hand side the inputs into that main supply chain. Animal feed code, which covers the animal feed into the primary animal production standard, and of course food packaging standard that provides input into animal product manufacturing and also obviously into food manufacturing. You see the same in produce, you see the same in seafood, you see the same in other industry sectors where, because SQF is one of the few standards, in fact, the only GFSI standard that covers everything from primary production through manufacturing, storage and distribution, right through to retail and food catering, then you see that a lot of supply chains are looking at SQF to cover all their needs within that particular sector. So how do you get started? How do you get involved with SQF? Well, firstly, you need to learn about the SQF code. Now, unfortunately, all our documentation is in English or Chinese or Japanese. We don't have any documentation available in Korean at this point in time, but you can also attend training, and I'm sure SGS in Korea will be able to help you for that with that. So you need to learn about the SQF code, find out about it. The codes that I described before, just get a copy of it. They're free downloads as PDFs from the SQF website, which is sqfi.com. Just Google sqfi.com and look for edition 9 codes, and you can download any of the codes in English and some of the codes in Chinese. That's and Japanese. Register for SQF. You need to be registered with SQF. That is so we can get you onto your database, get your profile onto your database. The checklists are customized for your particular site. And so the audit reports can be registered and logged there as well. Registration is annual, but it's not expensive. It's roughly 400, it depends on the size of the operation, but it's roughly 400 US dollars per year. Most of the cost, by the way, you'll find is in the audit and certification process, but I'm sure SGS can give you a good deal there as well. But the registration is direct to SQF to get registered in the SQF database. And again, our team in the Asia market would be able to help you with that process. Then you need to prepare for your audit. And that is, you need to, once you get a copy of the standard, you need to make sure your documentation meets the requirements of the standards, and then that you're implementing your documentation. You're implementing your procedures, your HACCP plan, your policies, etc., to ensure compliance with the SQF standard, the appropriate SQF standard. And in your case, it would be the SQF Food Safety Code for food manufacturing. Once you have some records of implementation, you can schedule and conduct the audit. And may I recommend SGS in Korea as the appropriate certification body through which to schedule and conduct your audit. And then once you receive your SQF certificate, then you would renew your certificate on an annual basis. So it is a little bit more complicated than that. You will find a more detailed description in section A2, part A of the SQF code, which you can download from the SQF website. So that's all I have for you this afternoon. I hope you got something out of this. If you do have any more questions, please contact either Sarah Wu or myself. Sarah Wu is our SQF representative for China and Korea, is based in Taipei, but she covers China and Korea. Unfortunately, she's not doing too much traveling just now either, but Sarah will be able to take your questions, answer your questions, or be able to point you in the direction of someone who can do that. You've also got my Korean and my Asian languages are not all that good. So please, if you're contacting me, please do so in English, but you have my email address there as well. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your time this afternoon. And please, if you do have any follow-up questions, I'm sure SGS in Korea will be able to assist you. If not, please contact either Sarah or myself, and we'll try and assist.